preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Welcome to the second evening of Backstage Pass, Values and Visions Behind the Scenes. My name is Rabbi Jennifer Krause, and I am the host of the series. And this evening, I am delighted to have with me Dr. Maria Rosa Menocal, and we are sure to have a spirited evening of dialogue ahead of us. For those of you who aren't familiar with Backstage Pass, which is a new series to the Y, the idea of Backstage Pass is to go backstage in another person's life, to get a sense of what motivates them in their work, in the choices that they make, the teachings, the traditions, the texts, and the issues that inspire them to walk their talk in the world. And so tonight we're going to go backstage with a very impressive individual. Dr. Menocal is a professor at Yale. She is the R. Selden Rose Professor of Spanish and Portuguese, although a little secret, she doesn't speak Portuguese. Just learn, see, backstage, you wouldn't have gotten that unless you'd been here. And she's also the director of the Whitney Humanities Center. She's the author of a number of books, and most recently, and one that I'm delighted that we'll be discussing this evening, is The Ornament of the World: How Muslims, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain. There are many, many issues in this book that are relevant, if not hyper-relevant, for the landscape of life that we are all a part of now in a forever changed world. So, without further ado, we'll begin our discussion, and we also invite you to become part of the conversation with a comment, with a question, and we'll do our best to make this a dialogue that takes place not just here, but amongst all of us. So, maybe by way of introduction, if you could just tell us a little bit about, you were born in Cuba.
Yes.
So if you could tell us about your early beginnings and how you came to the United States.
Oh. Well, the brief answer to that is probably self-evidently because of the Cuban Revolution. But in fact, my own personal story about that is more complicated than most. But I won't necessarily tell that. Except to say that my parents were very much involved in the Cuban Revolution, and we went back and forth throughout the first 10 years of my life. And then ended up in this country after about 1963. And then I grew up in lovely suburban Philadelphia on the main line, and am very much a product of that in many ways, certainly at least as much as of the other.
And tell us a little bit about how your scholarship led you to this particular field.
Well, I always tell people I got into Islamic Spain through the back door because, in fact, I was doing graduate work mostly in French and Italian, which were the two real loves of my life at that point. And I was working in this field, which basically no longer exists, which is called Romance Philology. And I was the last recipient of this degree in the department that granted it in that particular university. But what you did was you studied all of the Middle Ages in the Romance-speaking world. And I actually was doing a pretty classical trajectory in that area, which meant that the most important of the literatures that you studied was the poetry of the troubadours of Provence, of southern France. And I began to work in that area, and I sort of ran into the first, as it would turn out, of a series of obscure but interesting and suggestive articles about the ties that poetry, which flourishes in like the 11th century and the 12th century, the ties of that to this world that was mentioned, that was Islamic Spain, but which was always presented as being something that was completely remote from it in every respect. And so most of the scholarship about that was really attempts. Most of them ultimately failed to show that there was some connection. I mean, failed because nobody believed it. I mean, it remained a sort of footnote in literary history. And I, who tend to like either things that are, I root for the underdog is probably an understatement, decided that this was what was really the most interesting thing, was this theory that basically posited that this most central and important canonical poetry of Western civilization, i.e. the poetry of the Provençal troubadours, which really is the beginning of modern European culture in some crucial ways, that this poetry really was itself a derivative of this other world about which I knew virtually nothing, and none of us knew very much at all. And that was, as it turned out, the world of Islamic Spain. So then I began to study that. I wrote my dissertation on the question of why it was that, even though this was such an obviously suggestive series of connections between these worlds, that nobody paid any attention to it. And that was how I began. And I didn't actually, for a long period of time, I still don't feel I have abandoned the work that I did in Italian and in French, which I had started out. But it getting sucked into work on Islamic Spain and medieval Spain in general was very easy to do, because it is extremely rich and fascinating, and because almost nobody does it or did it at the time. It's now become practically a sexy topic, which is amazing. I was noticing, reading in the booklet for the center here, that there's like even a cruise now to, Al-Andalus. Well, I mean, 5 years ago, you said Al-Andalus. How many people knew what that was, let alone that people would sign up and pay money to go on a cruise there? So that has changed in significant ways. But I assure you, at the time, part of the attraction for me was that I really could write in an area that was, on the one hand, nobody worked. I mean, nobody else was doing their dissertation in that area, let alone something else beyond that. But it was also big and significant, because a lot of people do dissertations in an area nobody's ever worked on, but that's because they're these tiny little things. And this was clearly not a tiny little thing. It was a very big thing, but I could do that. So I went in through that crescent area there that is called Languedoc, which in fact is a crescent that exists both in what is now France, but also in Spain, and that's really a shared cultural area. And that, I mean, that's a real historical and geographic connection. But that's how I got there.
So it's interesting, because your journey to this area of study in a lot of ways is representative of the boundary crossing of the world of which you write. The notion of, I was reminded as I was reading your book of actually last week's, the portion of the Torah that we read last week called Lech Lecha, which means to go forth, in which this guy named Abram becomes Abraham, who is the father of the Jewish people, and he is referred to as the Ivri, which means literally Hebrew, but the root is from the infinitive la'avor, which means to go out or to cross boundaries. Mm-hmm. And in fact, with this book in particular, you depict a world in which there was a great deal of of boundary crossing, and also in the act of writing this book, you crossed a boundary from sort of academic, I guess, strict academic writing to popular writing. So can you tell us a little bit about how this book came into being?
Well, I will in a second, except I do want to say one thing about this boundary crossing things, which is important, which is that, in fact, the problem is, a lot of the problem of understanding this period is that we have different boundaries, but there is no boundary at the Pyrenees in the 12th century. And people are speaking the same language in Barcelona as they are, in areas that are now France. And a great deal of the difficulty and the problems with understanding the Middle Ages comes from people's often completely unconscious assumptions that that boundaries that exist for us and that have existed, for 200 years, big deal, somehow also existed 800 years ago, which they did not. And there's a whole series of boundaries that we assume exist and have always existed because they exist for us and appear to have existed for a long period of time that are simply were not the case. And the configuration, the geographic and linguistic configurations of most of the Middle Ages are dramatically different from what they would come to be in the modern period. And so the problem of crossing boundaries is to a very great extent ours and not that of the period. And it has to do with understanding the extent to which, the fact that we, for example, are likely to assume that Muslims spoke Arabic and, Christians spoke, Spanish, whatever that is. Well, by and large, this is nonsense. Christians spoke Arabic too. I mean, these are, so there's a whole series of these different kinds of boundaries, whether they're geographic or religious or linguistic, et cetera, that where the configurations are so completely different and they seem unimaginable to people because they were so eradicated at the end of the Middle Ages, so to use that. So that's one thing. So how did I come to write this book? Well, I have to answer it since the agent of the writing of the book in both the literal and the metaphorical senses, that's Alice Martell is here. And so I came to write the book because I was asked by the Yale Alumni Association to give a talk for one of the alumni weekends that they do. They do these reunion weekends where the 5-year classes are all there. And they have, they ask for every one of these every year, they ask 2 or 3 members of the Yale faculty to give these big talks to the assembled reunion classes. And so I said, sure, I'll do one. And then they called up and they said, well, here's what you have to do. You've got 50 minutes and you've got to give them an idea of the work that you do, what your research is and what you teach and so on and so forth. And you have to understand that most of these people have not been in a classroom for 30 years and that, they're educated people, et cetera, et cetera. They all have Yale degrees, of course. I wouldn't want to have to talk to people without Yale degrees. And but they don't know anything about this stuff. They don't know anything. So you've got to start from the ground up and you've got to give them this big picture in 50 minutes. So it was hard work because it was probably the first talk I ever gave that was at that general a level. I mean, I've been giving academic talks for many years, obviously, but I hadn't done anything that was so explicitly meant for an educated but not but group of people who didn't know anything about where Islamic Spain was or what it was or why anybody should know anything about it. And so I realized, of course, how very difficult that is to do. But I worked very hard at it and I did it, and it was a great success. And it was clear to me then that in some sort of very vague way that that there was an obviously interesting subject there for people outside of the academy and outside of my general area. And and then the first of, actually there's another agent who is not here tonight, and that is Jean Bloom, who is a good friend, and she and I rode on the train together, and she read the talk, and by the time we were both coming into New York, since Jean and Harold Bloom do live in New York, and by the time I got home, Harold was on the phone saying, "Okay, you got to write this book," and so forth. And he said, "And I'm calling my agents on Monday morning." And I said, "No, Harold, don't call your agents." But so Monday morning, I called my friend Alice Martell, who is an agent, and we took it from there. And Alice walked an academic who had never written for the trade press through multiple drafts of the book proposal alone, which was, I mean, I couldn't believe how hard could it be to write a book proposal. Oh, it's terrible to have to write a book proposal. And Alice mercilessly made me rewrite and so on and so forth. And then I had this terrific editor at Little Brown who also kept tearing up everything that I wrote and told me I had to start all over again on a very regular basis. But he was very good-humored about it and so forth. So, I mean, part of the reason I'm answering this in great detail is it does not come easily to an academic to write a trade press book. I mean, I could have just said that, but the truth is and in my case, it did involve having people who were really invested in making that work take the trouble to do so.
It's in addition to crossing that boundary into writing for a totally different audience, you also ended up writing an op-ed in the New York Times that appeared March 28th, which was a day after after what has come to be known as the Passover massacre. There was a suicide bombing in Netanya, where people were celebrating Passover. And so you ended up being a voice during a very difficult time, specifically over the course of the year since September 11th. And in that piece, you talk about, use the phrase, which I love, complex and contradictory identities. And you talk quite a bit about those assumptions, and I'm glad that you said the assumptions of boundaries in much the same way as you say we make assumptions also about the Middle Ages and what medieval means. When in fact you read this book and you realize the level of scholarship and life in general that was going on could hardly be called medieval given our associations with that term.
Oh yeah, well medieval is great. You know, a lot of medievalists actually, I always thought I was the only one who did it. Turns out a lot of medievalists do it, that you keep little lists and card catalogs and files of the really terrible uses of the word medieval. I mean, medieval is synonymous with, every bad and backwards sort of thing imaginable. And I mean, I have hundreds. I have a whole file that I keep of these, and you always think you've seen, the last great one, but you haven't. Although the truth of the matter is that all you have to do is open a thesaurus, and the list of what the cognate words for medieval are pretty bad, including prehistoric animals, and it goes down this, dinosaurs, and it's really quite hilarious. But indeed, and people sometimes ask me, well, how did it come to mean such a bad thing? And it's actually not an uninteresting question, to which the first answer is that it's because the Renaissance called it that, and they were, overweening and very self-centered and believed that they really had invented civilization as we know it. And so a great deal of their effort was spent in bad-mouthing everything that preceded them and so forth. But the interesting thing is, of course, in that sense, we are the heirs of that Renaissance, and it really is the Renaissance that, and it is a number of specific people during that period of time. But the other and even more, or at least as important thing is that it is the it really is the Enlightenment 18th century notion that no period of time that had that much religion in it could have been anything other than dark. That is that, and the anti-medieval prejudices of many of the great writers and thinkers of the 18th century are really quite amazing when you actually read them.
It's so, just what you said just now about that there's an idea that an era in which there was so much religious activity could hardly have been anything other than medieval in all of the senses of the word, as you just reminded us,
right.
Exist. And yet this idea of complex and contradictory identities, right. There are 4 personalities specifically in the book that 4 Jewish personalities whose complex and contradictory identities and whose religious journeys really fly in the face of these notions of what medieval means. For instance, this I'd love to talk about Chazdai,
mm-hmm.
And maybe in a moment you could give us a little synopsis of his story. But he is definitely someone who is an example of the way in which this time period allowed Jews to realize that you could be both religious, observant, and that being religious and observant was not necessarily something totally distinct from being rational and intellectual and learned and in the world. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about him?
Well, yeah, I should say that, so that I don't forget to say that one of the things that's interesting about this subject is that the people who championed Chazdai and all the rest of the Jewish figures of Islamic Spain, especially the poets eventually, but the whole Jewish society as a whole, were not the Sephardic Jews who had a different kind of relationship with the history of Spanish Jewry eventually, but in fact were the 19th century German Ashkenazi scholars who, for whom, when they began to study the history of this community in Spain that was fully Arabized, fully secularized in quotes, in the sense that they were fully a part of a community that was not Jewish and that was learned in non-Jewish matters as well as being in other ways. It was for them that this seemed to be the exemplary historical moment when they were able to be both, where being Jewish did not mean not being a part of the government, not being, not a philosopher, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very interesting that the whole history of not only the scholarship, but the understanding and appreciation of all of this is actually, originally a German phenomenon, and very much reflected, their ideal community of what they thought that they ought to be able to be, and was also a reaction against the cloistered religious communities that did not have anything to do with the outside world and so forth. And as a matter of fact, I was thinking as I was riding in a cab up from downtown that all you have to do is go over and look at Central Synagogue on Lexington and 50, whatever it is. And I remember the first time I ever saw it, I was just, you walk down the street and you see this building, which is unambiguously, as you're walking towards it, you wonder the first time you don't know what it is, why is there this odd-looking building that looks like the Great Mosque of Cordoba sitting there in the middle of Lexington Avenue? Where did that come from? The first time I ever saw it, I thought it was some sort of bizarre Disneyland-like weird building, but it still didn't compute. Why would anybody have built this in the middle of Lexington Avenue? And then, of course, you get closer and you realize that this is, Central Synagogue, and it is very explicitly built to look like the Great Mosque of Cordoba, and not by a Jewish community that is descendant from the Jews of Cordoba. That's the I mean, that's one of the interesting parts of that story, is it is built, in fact, by a community of Jews for whom that represented a world that they were they were hoping that they could themselves achieve something like that. So it's an act of homage to something that is not part of their own background, and so forth. So that's extremely important to understand, that is where all of that, and that is why, if somebody asks you, why does Central Mosque look, there you go. But that is why it looks like that, and so forth. So Hasdai ibn Shaprut is the first of the figures of this period that we know a great deal about. And the reason that he is immensely significant is that he lives at the time of the declaration of the Caliphate of Cordoba in the middle of the 10th century. In other words, he lives during the period of time that becomes the apogee of the Islamic the Islamic State, that was first really just a semi-independent part of the rest of the Islamic world, but then declared itself fully independent. And in fact, technically at least, they were really declaring themselves to be the center of the Islamic world. The middle of the 10th century in Cordoba is very much the height of this civilization in many ways. It's when it reaches its peak, and Hasdai lives at that moment. And in fact, the title of the book, speaking of boundaries that we can't even imagine and so forth. The title of the book is stolen from this poem by a German nun who's also contemporary of these guys at the same time. But this nun is living off in Saxony at the time of the court of Otto II, and she never goes. I had known about this poem for a long time, and I always wondered, why had she gone to Cordoba? Why is there some German nun in Cordoba? Which always, because I'd read this in graduate school. That was part of your training in Romance philology, was you read weird texts like that no one else ever read, but you got to read these little snippets of. Little did I know that remembering this one day would be a useful thing. But she didn't go. She didn't go to Cordoba. The reason that she knew about Cordoba, sitting up there in her little nunnery in Germany, is because the diplomatic world was in fact extremely vital during this period of time. And the Caliph, who in many ways, Abdulrahman III, is exemplary of this very interesting society, had a diplomatic corps that included, among other things, Hasdai ibn Shaprut, who was, as far as we can tell, the head of the diplomatic corps. He really was. He was the highest ranking member and so forth. He was at the same time the highest ranking member of the Jewish community itself. But it also, by the way, had, which I didn't know until relatively recently, it also had high-ranking Christian members, including, I can't remember his name, Rabbi, I'll look it up in a second. I mean, he has an Arabized name. He was, as were the Christians of the Caliphate, he was an Arabized Christian, and he was the bishop of what is in effect the province of Al-Andalus at that period of time. And he was, like Hasdai, his partner, was also a part of the Caliph's diplomatic corps. But his assignment was to the court of Otto. And so he was there for a prolonged period of time. And it's obvious that Ras Witha had contacts with him. And he told her all about how great Cordoba was. He also told her, which is very interesting, about the fact that there was this history of Christian martyrs in Cordoba, which there was. And so Ras Witha, so here you have this German nun who's hearing about this far-off place, and she decides to write, because it's one of the genres that you can write at that time, one of the lives of the martyrs, and to be able to write the lives of the martyrs. So she decides to write the life of one of these martyrs of Cordoba. But she begins the poem by giving this great description of Cordoba as the ornament of the world, and she details all the reasons why, which are, here they study all this good stuff. They have the 7 liberal arts. It's the richest place on earth. They have, running water and good food. I mean, she doesn't say that, but it's clear that it's, she has a great appreciation of this, which she has gotten from this guy. But she feels no sense that it's any violation of the presentation of the life of this martyr to lay out that this is this great place. Mostly what it is clear that the rest of Europe, when they knew about it, did appreciate was the sensational difference in the quality of intellectual life. I mean, the measure which is often given, which it still is important to give because it gives you a sense, is that Cordoba at that period of time, probably had at least 400,000 to 500,000 books in its various libraries, when in the entire rest of Latin Christendom there might have been 4. Roswitha would have known that maybe there were 400 or 500 other volumes combined. So you're talking, and she knows that, and she appreciates it. She's an intellectual. She's been, we don't know that much about her. Anyway, so she gives this wonderful praise of Cordoba. And even more astonishing is she describes the Umayyad, the Islamic policy of the protection of the other peoples of the book as, existing. And she says, and here's the one thing you can't do. The caliph will allow you. You're allowed to, you're allowed to practice your faith with no interference. People will not prosecute. She practically lays out to them in her little poem she says, this is what you're allowed to do, and you're allowed to do it. Now, there's one thing you can't do under this, and that is you can't blaspheme the prophet. You can't. And this is what these guys did. So they became martyrs. So now I'm going to tell you the life of the martyr. And so it's this wonderful, again, mixture of things where there's an ability to have that complex appreciation of those. But Hasdai is part of that universe and is part of it at that moment when it is really at its peak. And he is the head of the diplomatic corps. And plays an important role in the various negotiations and discussions with Constantinople in particular, because of the complex series of alliances. Again, things are never what they seem to be or where we would expect them to be, because I think we're all taught that, the Middle Ages in particular is just a sequence of stories of, Christians against Muslims or whatever, or a series of struggles. Well, in fact, the great alliances of the middle of the 10th century are, the Islamic Al-Andalus in alliance with Constantinople, which is obviously Christian, against, on the one hand, their mutual Islamic enemies, Muslim enemies, the Fatimids and the remains on the one hand, and Otto, who is a real problem, who's a Christian. So it's, these are strategic sorts of things. And finally, Hasdai, well, not finally, because there's like a million things, but Hasdai is important for one other thing, which will resound in history and in Jewish history in very interesting ways, which is, as far as we can tell, Hasdai is the person who really begins to, who establishes through this letter that he wrote, the existence of the Khazars. It is this famous letter that Hasdai writes to the king of the Khazars, if you exist. I mean, it's a wonderful letter. It begins, hello, if you are out there, here is what I want to say to you. And it's a great letter. I think I have part of it. The translator of this letter is also here. Geez, everybody came.
I would love just to read just a little bit of an excerpt from the letter that appears in the book, because it's striking. Hasdai is describing his homeland in Andalusia and says, "It is a land of grains, wines, and purest oils, rich in plants, a paradise of every sort of sweet, and with gardens and orchards where every kind of fruit tree blossoms, and those with silkworms in their leaves. Our land also has its own sources of silver and gold in her mountains. We mine copper and iron, tin and lead, coal and marble, and crystal." And I'm reading this and I'm so struck by it, because the words Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, a land flowing with milk and honey, were going through my mind as I was reading this. And this, in fact, is the way that he lovingly describes Andalusia, is so similar to the way that the land of Israel is described in the Torah and to the way it's described when the Israelites are just about to go into the promised land. Joshua, two characters, Joshua and Caleb, come back with glowing reports. Indeed, it is a land flowing with milk and honey. And clearly for Chazdai, this was his land flowing with milk and honey. And it was for so many other great Jewish figures and thinkers. But going again to the complex and contradictory identities, we go to someone like Yehuda HaLevi, Judah HaLevi, the great poet. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about him and his journey.
Could I just interrupt and ask
Yes,
a quick question?
please.
Really bothering me. I'm interested in the languages involved. Chazdai wrote that letter, for example, in Hebrew, in Judeo-Arabic,
In Arabic, it comes down to us in Judeo-Arabic. My guess is that, an educated guess is he wrote it in Arabic. It would not have been in Judeo-Arabic. He would have sent the letter in Arabic. And Arabic is both the mother tongue as well as the tongue of all education other than religious education of the Jewish community from, I hesitate to say from 712, but from, certainly by towards the end of the 8th century on. Yeah.
Maybe just jumping off of that,
Right.
maybe you could talk a little bit about Hebrew language,
Right.
And the way that it came to be used in a
Right.
new way.
But right. So Arabic is the language of the Jewish community for at this point for a very long time, and in fact, it's not just that the Jewish community speaks Arabic. They are because they rise, or the other way around, because they are very much a part of the educated elite. That is why they become a member of the ruling and intellectual elite as well. But the implications of that, it's important to understand that Arabic is a very poetry-centric language and linguistic culture at this time, and that's an education that Jewish community had alongside with the Muslims. And as a result of that, at a certain point, one of the things that develops, and it's the great thing that develops in terms of the history of Hebrew letters, is that, in effect, Hebrew is reinvented as the language that can be a vehicle for vernacular poetry for the first time. Then, since the time of David and Solomon, really, it becomes reestablished in that sense, and it's it's very much a result of the relationship that community of Jews had with Arabic, and particularly with Arabic poetry, and their understanding that you can have a language that is both a because Hebrew at that point was basically fossilized as a liturgical language, and only as a liturgical language. And the overcoming of the barrier to that, and reinvigorating it and reinventing it in a sense as a poetic language, very much comes out of a tradition, out of an Arabic-centered tradition where, the language of the liturgy and the language of God is not incommensurate with the language of love poetry, and of erotic love poetry, and of homoerotic love poetry, and of, poetry that in 50 different ways is in fact contradictory, or can be perceived so, of the, tenets of the religion.
Rabbis must have been scandalized.
They were rabbis who wrote much of this.
Really?
Oh, yes, indeed they were. So that begs all sorts of questions. Yes, indeed they were. In fact, not only were they rabbis, they were often the rabbis who were the leaders of the community, not just any rabbis, but the rabbis who were the most important. the most impressive of these in some ways is Shmuel Hanagid, who is the leader of the community of Jews in Granada in the early 11th century, and who writes all sorts of poetry that is in some ways problematic. And his son, who put together the collections of his poetry, mentions it and says, some people are going to have a hard time with some of these poems of my dad's, but he was a pious man. Boom, end of story. Then you read these poems and you say, okay, that's fine. But the way to deal with that is to understand, in a sense, that they're coming out of a poetic tradition, because their native poetic tradition is the Arabic poetic tradition. That's what their native poetic tradition is.
And then Shir HaShirim, which may have sanctified that kind of poetry.
The Song of Songs,
Yeah.
which is a highly erotic, extended love poem in the canon of the Hebrew Bible, which for many years the rabbis tried to explain the imagery away as that this was a dialogue between God and people, which in fact, you can go with that, but when you look at it, it's an erotic love poem. And it, in fact, in your book, you talk about the fact that it was someone like Shmuel Hanagid, with the way that he brought Hebrew into use into poetic use, and then brought Hebrew into vernacular in a way that actually made it possible for the Song of Songs to be read as an erotic love poem.
That's right. So anyway, in fact, Shmuel Hanagid is the first of the four great poets of this golden age. But the last one, and the one who's the most famous, is Judah HaLevi. And HaLevi is a very extraordinary and interesting and problematic character, because on the one hand, he is probably the most gifted of the poets as a poet, and he's very much the climactic poet of this 100 years of this new Hebrew poetry, which I should add. I mean, what needs to be added, which I haven't said, is that it was highly Arabized Hebrew poetry. I mean, it was Arabized, first of all, in its metrical patterns, and in a variety of other ways that had to do with the fact that Arabic was their native language, and so it was Arabized in ways that one would normally expect. It was the adaptation of a language that had no native speakers and didn't have. Hebrew didn't become the native language. It's not like the situation in Israel today, but this poetry became part of the literary world, and. So HaLevi is in many ways the greatest of these poets, and a very interesting character who led a very interesting life. He's the only one of them who's not an Andalusian, by the way. He comes from the Christian North, which is not an insignificant detail, because the Christian North at that point had the reputation of being, as with everything in the North period, as the great wasteland, and this is where barbarians lived and so forth. And there's wonderful quotes written by all sorts of people who ended up going up north for one reason or another, saying, you go up there and it's like living among dogs. It's this terrible stuff. But that dark north, which is the Christian North, for Jews is a very problematic place to imagine living at that period of time, for cultural reasons, by the way. They're just not educated people up there. They don't speak Arab. They don't know. They can't recite poetry in Arabic. So you can't be an educated person if you can't do that. And so HaLevi has this very interesting life in a lot of different ways. But at a certain point in his life, he decides that he's going to leave Spain. He's going to leave Al-Andalus, which is like the weirdest thing that anybody has ever heard, because no one can imagine living this place. And he's going to go to Jerusalem. And he begins to write a series of Zion poems, which are very interesting and very important and very influential. And he begins at the same time to write a series of prose works denouncing a great deal of the culture of which he is himself a product. And there are many different things, but two of these are noteworthy. One is that he writes a treatise on poetry, which basically denounces the idea of Arabized poetry, Arabized Hebrew poetry, that good Jews shouldn't be doing this Hebrew poetry that is, erotic and Arabized, i.e. all the stuff that he is the greatest master at doing. And so this is not an unknown thing in poetic history, by the way. All sorts of people spend their lives writing this stuff and then at the end say, only bad people would have written stuff like that. So this is not an unknown thing. And in fact, there's an important book that's written about the whole trope of this renunciation at the end of his life. But HaLevi didn't mean it as a trope because he eventually got on a ship one day and left Spain to become a religious man. So the other image is that this is a man at the end of his life who is renouncing this worldly culture and attempting to do that. But he also wrote a work which in many ways is even more influential than other things, which is the Kuzari. And the Kuzari is his great anti-philosophical tract. And it's based on the trope of that letter to the Khazars that goes back to Hasdai and so forth. But it is a denunciation again of that secularized life. So HaLevi plays this very odd role because on the one hand, particularly in his poetry, which is extremely influential and very important and very complex. He is very much the culmination of this very complicated and society. And yet the Kuzari, which is much studied and so forth, is the denunciation of the Greek religion, as he calls it. And so a lot of his works at the end of his life were the denunciations of this and so forth. So he's a complex character.
It's interesting also because Judah HaLevi's one of his most famous poems that was used in the Zionist movement begins, "My heart is in the east and I in the west, as far as the west as west can be. How can I enjoy my food? What flavor can it have for me? Nothing is right unless he's there." And he says, easily I could leave behind this Spain and all her luxuries, and yet he hangs out in Egypt for quite a while. Yeah. And apparently he either never makes it to Jerusalem, or he makes it, but in this horribly tragic way. Right at the walls, he's
trampled by a crusader. Well, there's
right. But sort of like Moses, he never quite makes it. Yeah. And yet he raises really interesting issues about the tropes of exile and redemption, which are very important tropes in Judaism. Mm-hmm. The idea of being outside of the land, of coming into the land, even though the Torah ends sort of looking into the land, but not going into the land. And the idea of Geulah, of redemption, of being brought out of Egypt. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if Judah HaLevi would have been able to renounce his life and the comfort that he had in this one culture, and go back, or attempt to go back, if he would have been able to have done that if in fact he hadn't been living both in exile and at home.
I don't know. See, the problem with HaLevi is he's an almost unique figure in all of that history. I mean, he's exceptional. No one else wanted to emigrate from Spain and go to the promise. I mean, Spain was the promised land, and not only in Hasdai's, speaking of it in the middle of the 10th century, but at the time of the expulsions, Spain was still the promised land. And there's actually very poignant documents, treatises written from, significant people in the aftermath of the expulsions who were living, in the Galilee, who write about the tragedy of having to end their days so far from the Promised Land. I mean, the Promised Land was Spain, and that was what was lost. I mean, that's the great tragedy of that. So HaLevi, I'm not sure HaLevi is exemplary of anything other than himself. I mean, he's an idiosyncratic character. There are not too many other examples of people who play significant roles who feel that urge to emigrate to someplace else, even even in later years when it might have been more plausible. So he is idiosyncratic, I think. I mean, as far as I can tell.
Moses de Leon is another very important figure. He is, we now know, the author of the Zohar, of the great Jewish mystical text. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the text that he was peddling and how that came to be.
Well, I mean, it's a wonderful example of a forgery and a fraud, which was extremely popular. And the great story is one that which may be apocryphal, but probably is not actually apocryphal, which is that he'd been going around selling these little pamphlets, basically, the sum total of which is the Zohar, but he was selling them in serial form, and he was out on the streets of Castile and Leon selling this stuff, and it was being bought up like crazy. And he very laboriously made it, had made up the language so it looked like Aramaic, and the whole thing. And so he'd acquired this reputation of being the person who had, because what he told people was he had this giant text at home, and he would copy out parts of it and then go out and sell it a chapter at a time as he was able to copy it. And then when he died, a wealthy local other merchant came and said he wanted to marry the daughter who was still left alive, but the dowry had to be the original manuscript that had been being, and the wife said, there isn't one, and this was the beginning of it, and so forth. So, what you never hear is whether the poor girl ever got to get married or not. This is what she never, did she?
And that, after all, is the most important question.
Yeah, right.
Right.
So he clearly, this was, I mean, it's not, the Zohar, because of its odd language and its odd circumstances, is not, not necessarily normally thought of as Spanish, quote unquote, and yet it is very much a product of this whole other, culture that was very much a part of it out there, and it's a part of the culture, the very interesting, again, still mixed Jewish culture of Christian Spain, because the truth of the matter is that, of course, you have a vibrant Jewish community existing in Islamic Spain, technically speaking, for about 250 years, 350 if you push it. But after about 1085, the truth of the matter is that very much the same kinds of protections for the other peoples of the books, both for Muslims and for Jews, that Islamic Spain had, and as a result of which those Jewish communities in cities like Toledo, which was called the Jerusalem of the West, was as a Christian city for hundreds of years, did flourish and so forth, and a lot of different cultures. I mean, the Sarajevo Haggadah, I always tell people, it's not from Sarajevo. It is very much from, it's from that same place that Moises de Leon is from, and so forth. It's from a Christian. I mean, the problem with Christian Spain is that it is the most medieval, quote unquote, of all maligned medieval entities. But again, this is a backwards projection from 1492, or even if you say the last 100 years. But again, the truth of the matter is that when the Jewish community referred to Toledo as Jerusalem and the Jerusalem of the West, they were talking about a Christian city. And that had been Christian forever, and where they lived in circumstances, and again, things like the Sarajevo Haggadah speak to a level of material and intellectual prosperity that is amazing, and that lasted until, in 1364, the last of the really great synagogues of Toledo was built in 1364, and it's the most lavish of the surviving ones. Now, we don't know because there's only 2 that survive, but we know that in Toledo in 1360 there were anywhere from 15 to 20, and a new one was being built. So, and it's a city which again in 1350 has been Christian since 1085. It's an interesting. So it's more complicated than.
Well, and in fact, what's so fascinating about Moses de Leon and what he does is that in order to bring about a text that in fact is not only studied now and made it into the canon of texts that are studied, but Jewish mysticism in the late 20th and early part of the 21st century is a very hot thing to study, and for him to bring it into being, he felt that he had to pretend that it came from a rabbi in the 2nd, 3rd century, who and took great pains to write it largely in Aramaic, which is the language of the Talmud, and it's so fascinating that he. We talk a lot about assimilation. In the Jewish world, assimilation is a topic. It's a big topic. And these are people who you would refer to, and in fact you do refer to, as fully culturally assimilated. And yet there's so much richness in what that time and these people gave birth to in the way of an inheritance for the Jewish community of now, that it really raises the issue, much like we were talking about questioning the definitions of medieval. I think it forces us to question the definition of assimilation, which carries with it, for the most part, in the Jewish world, it carries with it a negative connotation. Maybe could you talk a little bit about your notions of what assimilation means?
Well, I mean, as I said, for me, what is noteworthy is very much that the study of these hundreds of years of Jewish life and culture and so forth was very much raised as the icon by communities of Ashkenazi Jews who believed in assimilation in that sense, and so the understanding of their degree of assimilation, so to speak, has comes from them, or it doesn't come from me. It's nothing original on my part, far from it, to say. What is interesting about HaLevi is that while he rejects that towards the end of his life, he rejects the assimilation, that level of cultural assimilation. He does so in theory, but not in practice exactly, which is also interesting. And part of the great irony and so forth of his trip east is when he finally manages to leave. He makes a stop in Egypt, but it's because the ship had to stop in Alexandria. But the reason that he then doesn't immediately go on and move on to Jerusalem is because when he reaches Alexandria and Egypt, he's this great star, because of course a very prosperous Jewish community there, and my God, it's the great Judah HaLevi. It was like the rock star of the period. And he'd come, and what do you mean you're not going to sing those great songs you've been writing for 30 years because they're in Arabic accents? These guys all speak Arabized Hebrew too, so for them it was inconceivable. But the best part, which he confesses to himself and ends up writing new poems about, is he realized he loved it. He loved the limelight, he loved performing these great songs, and well, yeah, he meant to go off and be a monk be.
But then he got groupies.
But he got groupies, and they liked this great, the new beat, which is what he had made great, and so forth, and so. So in fact, his renunciation of the world is, and in that sense, this one great book that's been written about that, about how this is a trope, it is important. In some ways, it's important to understand that HaLevi's renunciation of all of that is to some extent, is paradigmatic of, at the end of the day, you renounce all that hard living that you did and say that you're going to lead a life of virtue in all sorts of ways. And that's what a great deal of his is. But the truth of the matter is that with a handful of exceptions, the distinction of the Jewish communities of Spain, whether it was the communities of Islamic Spain, from 800 until 1085, if you wish, or something, or the communities of Christian Spain from 1085 until the expulsions, is that they were fully integrated. And indeed, a great deal of the pathos, as I said, of 1492 has to do with the extent of that integration into society. There is the terrible scene of, if one understands it, of, when Ferdinand and Isabella, when Isabella marches up the hill to take Granada, she does so, A, dressed in her fashionable Moorish garb, as it is described on the one hand, and B, accompanied by her retinue of Jewish advisors, who little suspected what was about to happen. So that's they were fully integrated. They were the senior people at the court, just as Hasdai had been at the court and so forth, even though we're talking about distances of 500 years. And it is a part of that scene, obviously, and what is interesting is that it's a part of the scene because the integration, in that sense, was not to a secular community as we would understand it, but in fact to communities of other religious faiths and so forth. So it was an assimilation under other sorts of circumstances. Now, for me, part of the moral of the story is, in a funny way, it was easier because it's certainly some of the ways in which in terms of the reinvention, for example, of Hebrew, my vision has always been that the ability to use Hebrew in these ways that were contradictory to the religion, came naturally to a community that saw that pious Muslims did it too. I mean, so it's not, there's this whole, it's always more complicated than that. And so those complications, so part of the problem is understanding these religious communities as not being complicated because they were.
So speaking of things being complicated, this book has come out, and there are a lot of people who think that you're Jewish, and in fact, you are not.
Right.
Backstage.
Right.
You were raised Catholic.
Yes.
And so maybe you could talk a little bit about being now on the circuit and having people sort of just assume that, oh, well, of course you're Jewish.
Well, it's true. It does happen all the time. It's very interesting. I was telling somebody before we came over today that actually it happened before I published the book too, it's led to a number of interesting circumstances. It's interesting to me that almost no one has ever assumed I'm Muslim, for example, which would be at least as logical in some ways, and I have to say that I take it to be a part of, or a sort of indirect reflection of what I think is the atomization and the identity politics of a great deal of what has happened in this country, certainly in the last 20 or 30 years. It's happened in my profession. I have to say, it's not that I'm personally offended or anything like that at that assumption, but I am offended at some level at the assumptions that underlie that and the unconscious assumptions, i.e. that people only work in areas that have to do with their own identity. And in my profession, i.e. in literary studies, this was the beginning of the long downward slope to this really quite terrible place where it is today, where people only work on the literature that is their, heritage or has to do with their sexual orientation or whatever. And it's been a terrible downhill slope. And I think that it's all percolated up to the general area where the perception is that people only write and study the history or the literature that is a part of their community. And the communities, by the way, keep getting defined in narrower and narrower ways. And as I said, without meaning to suggest that I'm in any way personally offended, obviously not. And obviously at some level, my other answer to the question is that everybody whose ancestors left Spain in 1492 or shortly thereafter, as at least some of mine did, is inevitably, ultimately, of very mixed ancestry in that sense. But that's not the issue. For me, I think the issue that this ultimately comes to bear on is that whole notion that has developed of identities, which is the negative side of the multicultural scenario, which is, and in many ways to me, is the antithesis of it, which is that everybody can only be and study and whatever it is that they are, and that they are becomes very narrow, which for me is the opposite of what I write about, because I write about people who are multiple things at the same time, and that's what makes that is what makes that a great society, that you can be a philosopher and a rabbi and a poet of a great, erotic and maybe blasphemous poetry at the same time. You shouldn't have to be the professor of blasphemous poetry, which means that you would never be associated with the
I'd like to know
bad
if you
people.
That chair.
So for me, that's what that. A lot of what that is about. And I think that does reflect that problem, and I think it's a problem in American public life.
Would anyone like to chime in with a question, a comment?
Yes.
On what you were saying, people who study their own kind, been their religion or sexual preference or anything else, do you find them being more narrow-minded?
Yes.
I would imagine they would be.
Yes. Because then you become a scholar of what it is that you are. And believe me, I can tell you in the academy that it's not just that then, only people who are that can study that. Then the ramifications of this go, there's many instances of it. I'm not sure how far down that road I want to go because it takes us off the track, but it does become a very ghetto. The word ghetto is the appropriate one. You have ghettos. Only certain people can study these kinds of things. And if you are that kind of person, then you can only do that. In an earlier stage of my career, I suppose it still happens, but I don't pay attention to it because I have other things going. I can't tell you the number of times when I know I have been either directly or indirectly criticized because I don't do women's stuff. So I would always say, you're right, I don't do women's stuff. I just, because at a certain point, again, it's part of this. If you were a woman and you were in literary studies, you had to do women's literature or women's this or women's that. Well, I'm sorry, I don't. I do Jewish stuff. Does that mean I'm Jewish? It goes down that. But you see what I'm saying. So they do become very closed ghettos, and it works both ways. I mean, the ghettoization works in both directions, and I think it's quite deplorable.
There's a general belief that people from Andalusia, and particularly the Jews who left Spain in 1492 and the year or so after that, that there had actually been a lot of intermarriage, and that when Rabbi Krause asked you about your identity as a Jew or as a Catholic, I thought to myself, looking at you, you could be anything. And you even mentioned Arabic, that no one assumed that you were Muslim, but you could be. I mean, just looking at you're probably a genetic mixture. And I've listened to many Jewish people from the Near East and from that Mediterranean area, which is where most of the expulsados went eventually. And many people who are now Christian have sangre judía, have Jewish blood, or have Muslim blood. Have you found records of that?
Oh, well, this is, of course, very widely known, but it's even more important than that, i.e., from the very beginning, of course, first of all, being a Muslim is not an ethnic group, and the ethnic groups that enter as Muslims, the Iberian Peninsula, are, already about 80% Berber and 20% Arab, and they're all men, and there's about 80,000 of them, which means that by 712, you already have a second generation of Muslims, as that's what they will be, who are intermarried, and so on and so forth. So, let alone 500 years later, which is part of why, I never use the word more, because it suggests it suggests very clearly that you're talking about this distinct group of people, which they are not. I mean, being a Muslim in Spain as anywhere else is only a religion and not an ethnicity, and the ethnicity of the Muslims of Spain is one that is unambiguously rooted in a very mixed heritage from the very beginning, and where the vast majority of Muslims from the 9th century on are all converts from Christianity. So in fact, the ethnic mix, and then the conversions start to work in the other direction after a certain point in time. So there is no ethnic purity in the Iberian Peninsula. The records of Jewish intermarriage are very different and very not, less well known, but clearly there. But what is certainly known is that of the immigrants to the New World, and I am, at least, part of my background is the product of that immigration to the New World is first of all, that the immigration of the first 100 years is overwhelmingly from the two provinces of Andalusia and Extremadura, which are the two, southern provinces, and B, that significant portions of these people are within a certain period of time, immigrants to Christianity. So it's a very, very mixed. The very notion of any kind of purity there is preposterous.
Just before we'll take one more question.
In this rainbow of people, could you place Ibn Gabirol? Is he a religious writer? Is he a literary writer? How would you compare him to the others, and how would you place him?
Well, he's one of the great four. He is more religious as a poet than many of the others, and probably even more so than HaLevi. But he is, he's up there in that at that level with them. Yeah.
I just have a quick question with language.
Go ahead.
At some point during the Middle Ages, you begin to write the poetry in Hebrew characters. So you have Ladino being written in Hebrew, the Provençal poetry also being written in the Hebrew. When does that really begin, that you have to, as a Jew, or was it an edict that you had to start writing, that you could no longer...
No. Judeo-Arabic starts to be written early on. relatively. The only reason that I said that Hastai's letter wouldn't have been written in Judeo-Arabic is he would have had no reason to assume that they could read. And Arabic was, I mean, he was the great stylist of Arabic of his time. That's how you got to be the vizier. And there was no reason that you would have sent out a letter from the foreign ministry in anything other than, the best Arabic possible.
Poetry, so that French poetry is written in Hebrew characters and Spanish is written in Hebrew characters. So you have to really have a knowledge of both.
Yeah.
And to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Why would they start writing it in the Hebraic characters?
I don't know when some of that vernacular poetry, I mean, the first thing to be said is that the vernacular poetries didn't necessarily have any particular alphabet they had to be written in. I mean, the Middle Ages is also the moment of the invention of the new languages of Europe, i.e., the vernaculars. And the truth of the matter is that if you're talking about the 11th or the 12th or the 13th centuries, which is what we're talking about, there's no compelling reason that it should be written necessarily in any of the alphabets. Now, as we know, of course, eventually it would end up being written in the Latin alphabet, but a great deal of it, including some of the stuff, is written in the Arabic alphabet and a lot of the mixed language poems and so forth. But those vernaculars didn't have any fixed forms and didn't have any extraordinary legitimacy as written languages at that point in time anyway. So there's some level of experimentation. But I don't know when the
But there was no prescription. In other words, the Jewish philosophy was not prescribing that you couldn't write in the vulgar languages, so-called.
No,
You had to write it
not that I know of. I can't, no.
One more, because I know you're a student, a former student.
Privilege, I guess. It does seem ironic that in this age of the internet and globalization, there seems to be less awareness and less acknowledgement of the mutual influence that these three major groups had on each other. And I just wonder if, through the horror of misunderstanding the results, this baffles and amuses you in any way, and when did globalization occur anyway? You don't have to answer that. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about it, about what's happened today.
Well, as I said, I mean, coming from a background where to have mentioned Al-Andalus would have required a 25-minute explanation 10 years ago, to a place where there's cruises given that are announced as being, cruise to Al-Andalus and the land of tolerance, it's far more understood. But I think you're asking a different question. Are you mean the general
Understanding, awareness, mixing, openness. We seem to claim it today, but we're really not
Yeah,
claiming it
I actually have to say that for me, it comes with the lack of understanding of what the Middle Ages are, because it is the Middle Ages that is the great period of that, and we tend to be products of the national cultures that begin, if you want, in 1492, but that are throughout what we call the Renaissance, and what we glorify as the Renaissance as our ancestry. And yet this is a moment of time at which it's not only that the Jews are expelled from Spain. I mean, that's only part of a larger picture where you all of a sudden move from multilingual societies to unilingual societies, et cetera, et cetera. You develop concepts of nationhood, which would have been virtually inconceivable throughout the Middle Ages, and not just in Spain, by the way. I mean, somebody said, what does an educated person read and write in London? Well, A and B and C, including French, which of course would eventually not be the case. So, the Middle Ages is the great moment during which all those things take place, and it gets relegated in our educational system to this dark hole. It is the black hole of Western culture, and it's openly defined as that. In textbooks to this day, you've got our classical heritage, and then that falls apart, and then you've got this black place, and then the Renaissance comes along and restores it. You've got to be kidding me, but it's true. And that's still, I still teach in directed studies at Yale, which is, I still have to give the lecture that surprises all of these kids who are products of good good schools, as we like to say. And it's the first time they heard that anything happened. And the syllabus of directed studies I've had to struggle with to include one or two things from the medieval period, because it basically goes, it's this whole extended historical period during which that happened, which not only doesn't exist, but which is held up to be the model of everything that we're not and that we overcame. Maybe we did overcome, unfortunately.
I'm going to have to, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to draw the evening to a close, and I'm sure that in addition to Dr. Menocal's book, The Ornament of the World, is available outside, and I'm sure that she will be kind enough to remain after to sign your book and to schmooze with you and answer the unanswered questions. But in the meantime, I really want to thank you very, very much for coming and sharing a little bit of yourself and your work with us, and helping us to challenge the assumptions that we make about having claimed the rights to words like tolerance and things, when in fact we could take a page or many pages out of your book and out of the time that you depict that could be very helpful to us as we go through some uncharted territory in our own world today. So thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
Just a few announcements, because it's not a gathering at a Jewish institution without a few announcements. There won't be Kiddush afterwards, but there will be books. And also on November 20th, it's a Wednesday night at 7:30, will be our next installment of Backstage Pass, and we are very, very excited to welcome Danny Meyer here. He is a chef and restaurateur, owner of Union Square Cafe, Gramercy Tavern. We'll be talking about food and many other things. So we invite you to join us for that evening. In addition to that, on December 11th, apropos of our discussion here tonight, Bruce Feiler is hosting a series here at the Y called the Abraham Summit. And we invite you to be there on December 11th. In many ways carrying forward the themes of this evening's conversation. So again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.